Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to really cut through some of the historical fog that surrounds a short, but an incredibly explosive Old Testament prophecy. We're talking about the book of Nahum, and we want to find out exactly how this ancient word can speak with stunning clarity to our own, let's face it, turbulent world. This deep dive is really tailored for you, the thoughtful Christian who wants to get a thorough grasp on this without getting lost in all the academic weeds.
And we're diving into a book that, right from the start, operates on this really stunning central paradox. Nahum is, it's famous. It's the oracle against Nineveh. It's announcing the sudden catastrophic fall of the Assyrian Empire.
Yeah.
But the whole point of that announcement isn't just destruction for its own sake. It's to offer this deep, profound, really anchored consolation to God's people, Judah, who were just absolutely terrified of Assyria. So you see, Nahum is fundamentally about two things happening at once: justice being fulfilled, and at the same time, care being secured.
That dual message is the engine of the whole book. It really is. And to truly appreciate the seismic shift that Nahum announced, we have to recognize the historical contrast that's setting the stage. We are not reading the book of Jonah.
Right.
A century before Nahum, Jonah goes to Nineveh, and amazingly, Nineveh repents. The king, the people, even the animals, they're all in sackcloth. God shows this boundless mercy, and the judgment is, it's stayed. But when Nahum shows up a century later, he comes to declare that repentance is just a memory now. It was a borrowed season of grace that had been completely abandoned.
And that creates such a crucial frame for us, both historically and theologically. The source material really emphasizes this, that Nahum is a powerful case study.
Yeah.
It shows us how God governs the rise and fall of every single nation, all within his larger program of redemption. He's patient, incredibly patient. But that patience is not permission. When a nation's wickedness matures, when its corporate sin becomes institutionalized and relentless, the justice that was delayed by mercy, it arrives right on schedule.
So, as we start this depth dive, let's just keep these two non-negotiable truths in our minds. They're the anchors of Nahum's message. First, and this is to the proud empires of the world, God's enemies cannot hide from his inevitable judgment. No wall is high enough, no army is strong enough. Second, and this is so crucial for the fearful hearts of his people, God's people cannot be separated from his preserving care. That clarity is absolutely vital because, first, we need to appreciate just how huge the problem of Assyria was for the tiny, fearful kingdom of Judah. Okay, so let's ground ourselves firmly in the 7th century BC. When exactly is Nahum speaking? Based on internal clues in the book and external historical records, we can place his ministry most likely in the period between 663 DC and 612 BC.
And those dates are important.
They're everything. 663 is when the great Egyptian city of Thebes or Noamon was destroyed. 612 is when Nineveh itself finally fell. So this chronological placement means Nahum was preaching when Assyria was still, for all intents and purposes, at the absolute peak of its terrifying power. To any geopolitical observer at the time, Nineveh looked untouchable. And yet, this prophet stands up and declares definitively that their end is fixed and it is imminent.
The audacity of that is just. It's hard for us to grasp unless we understand the context of fear it was spoken into. For the average person living in Judah, Assyria wasn't some distant theoretical threat. No, it was a deep, generational, psychological scar.
Yeah.
You have to rewind, maybe 50 years before Nahum's time to really feel that dread. Back in 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel, their brothers, their kin, was completely obliterated by the Assyrians. The population was deported, scattered across the empire, and their history, for the most part, just ended.
And the scars were even fresher than that. Within the lifetime of Nahum's oldest listeners, maybe 70 years prior, you had the devastating campaign of Sennacherib in 701 BC. The Assyrian army just swept through Judah, destroyed dozens of fortified cities, left a path of total desolation right up to the walls of Jerusalem itself.
Right, that's the story where the angel of the Lord strikes down the Assyrian army.
Exactly. The miracle that saved Jerusalem. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. But that miracle didn't remove the physical damage, and it certainly didn't remove the haunting psychological memory. The fear was visceral. It was a daily reality that Assyria could come back at any moment and finish the job.
And that reality, that fear, it was manufactured. I think you said it was calculated. It wasn't just incidental cruelty. It was Assyrian imperial policy.
Yeah.
It was designed specifically to break the will of any resistance before it even had a chance to start.
That is the key distinction. We aren't talking about random battlefield atrocities. We're talking about strategic terror codified into their military doctrine. If you look at the historical records, the famous reliefs that Nineveh themselves created to glorify their power, they detail the horror, Public impalements on stakes, forced deportations of massive populations. This was a deliberate policy to mix people up so they'd lose their national identity.
Wow.
And perhaps the most psychologically damaging part was the ritual humiliation of conquered kings. They'd often put ropes through the noses of defeated rulers and just parade them through the streets.
It was psychological warfare on a grand scale. The source material captures this so perfectly when it says something like, "The world heard Assyria's chariots before it ever saw their dust." Their reputation was so absolute that nations would often surrender before the army even got there. They didn't just conquer territories, they shattered spirits. So imagine living in Judah, constantly knowing that if you fell out of line, your entire family, your entire community faced being uprooted, scattered, or tortured in front of everyone. That's the level of existential dread Nahum is speaking into.
And what was the symbol, the absolute center of this calculated, overwhelming power? Nineveh. We have to pause and just try to imagine Nineveh at its height. This wasn't just a big city. It was the nerve center of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf all the way to Egypt. Its walls were reportedly massive, some say 100 feet high, wide enough for multiple chariots to drive side by side on top. It had intricate canals, incredible engineering marvels ensuring its water supply and its defenses. Its storehouses were filled with the plunder of the entire Near East. Its libraries and archives, they gloated over every single conquest.
So Nineveh, in the mind of the ancient world, it projected this illusion of permanence. It just felt too big, too wealthy, too organized, and way too powerful to ever fail. And that kind of pride, it's theological, isn't it? It's not just political. When a nation or an empire believes it has achieved security and prosperity entirely through its own strength and its own violence, it's basically set itself up against the one true sovereign. And that, fundamentally, is the error Nahum is here to correct.
So, what exactly is Nahum doing when he speaks this prophecy? He's not offering Judah a clever political strategy. He's not saying, hey, go ally with the Medes or the Babylonians. He's not just congratulating the eventual victors. The prophet's intention is purely theological. He writes to declare God's unchanging, unchangeable decree and to anchor the fear-weary heart of Judah in the character of God.
That's the signature move of prophecy, isn't it?
It's the signature move of all biblical prophecy. It lifts the eyes of God's people above the temporary, terrifying headlines of human politics to the throne from which those headlines are ultimately governed.
Yeah, and that lift is so critical because it connects back to the history God has already written. This is where we see that principle the essay calls progressive revelation at work. Earlier, the prophet Isaiah had made this massive promise that the Assyrian yoke, that crushing, debilitating burden on God's people, would be broken. And not by Judah's political maneuvering, but by the Lord's own hand. Nahum, coming later, is essentially announcing that the clock has run out. The hour for that specific, long-awaited promise has come due. The nations move, they make their plans, but ultimately, God is the one orchestrating history to fulfill his covenant promises.
And imagine if we were sitting in Judah during the 620s BC, just enduring the shadow of this brutal empire. That announcement would have been explosive. It turns a political problem into a theological certainty. The question isn't how do we defeat Assyria? The question is when will God act? And Nahum provides the answer.
And that really helps us understand why we have to spend time on the cruelty of Assyria. Because the deeper the terror they inflicted, the more profound the comfort is that's offered by God's intervention.
Yeah.
I mean, if Assyria was just an annoying neighbor, their downfall would be minor news. But because they institutionalized violence, mocked God, and shattered his people, their demise becomes this necessary, powerful act of divine justice.
Which brings us directly into the message of the book itself. And what's so remarkable is that Nahum doesn't start with Nineveh, he starts with God. Chapter 1 is this profound, majestic theological overture, and it's the foundation for everything that follows. Without this view of God, the rest of the book is just, political gossip.
The prophet starts by detailing the character of the divine judge, and the description is, well, it's formidable. He's described as a jealous God, an avenging God, a sovereign God. But here's the theological tension that you have to wrestle with right away. Nahum confirms that he is slow to anger, which echoes all those great covenant declarations of God's patience, but then it's immediately qualified. He's also great in power, and the absolute final declaration is that he will by no means clear the guilty.
That phrase, will by no means clear the guilty, is a non-negotiable definition of justice, isn't it? So how do we reconcile that? Slow to anger with such rapid, decisive destruction, especially after 100 years of apparent delay since Jonah's time.
That is exactly the right question to ask. And I think the key is in how we define patience. God's slowness to anger isn't infinite. It's tethered to the possibility of genuine repentance. Nineveh had their century. a clear example of God's willingness to forgive even the most wicked. But they rejected that grace, and they went right back to their old ways, to their systemic violence. So when the judgment finally arrives, it's because he is slow to anger and faithful to his own standards that he must act. Justice isn't arbitrary. It's the necessary response to ripened, persistent evil.
And crucially, this divine portrait is completed in the very same chapter. Immediately after describing the terrifying scope of his power and justice, Nahum declares that God is, at the same time, a refuge for those who trust him.
This blending of attributes, I think the source material calls it the covenant coin. You can't separate the two sides. Judgment isn't arbitrary. It flows from God's holiness and justice. But equally, comfort isn't sentimental. It flows from his covenant faithfulness to his people. And when we understand that, we see why the fall of Nineveh isn't just a war prediction. It is, like the essay says, it's preaching theology. The whole geopolitical event becomes this active, dramatic, undeniable revelation of God's perfect righteousness being enacted in human history.
Let's move into the center of the prophecy, into chapter 2, where the imagery of destruction is just. It's absolutely stunning. Nahum uses poetry to paint a picture that, for the Assyrians, would have been psychologically devastating because it was, to them, unthinkable.
Yeah, he describes flashing chariots, crimson shields, panic in the streets, weakening knees, and faces drained of color. But what's most evocative to me is the image of the city as the lion's den. Nineveh, the capital, had earned this nickname because it operated like a pride of lions. They would go out, prey on smaller nations, drag the loot back to their central den, and just devour the spoils in safety. They were the great consumers of the Near East.
And what does Nahum declare about this lion's den? He says the lion is now silent, devoured, and the storehouses, which seemed inexhaustible, filled with the plunder of 1,000 campaigns, are emptied. This just exposes the absolute hollowness of human pride when it stands against a divine decree. Nineveh believed it had this bottomless capacity for taking, for consuming, for conquering. But Nahum, speaking for God, declares that there is, in fact, a limit. There's a boundary, and God himself sets the clock on human greed and cruelty.
That's a really powerful illustration for us today. When we look at global powers or corporations or even institutionalized movements that seem to operate without any moral restraint, just constantly consuming and preying on the weak. Nahum reminds us that their strength is borrowed, their leash is finite, and the purpose of describing the destruction isn't for us to, revel in the violence, but to understand that the greatest powers on earth are ultimately bounded by the divine will.
Then, in chapter 3, the prophet shifts his tone. He moves from that poetic imagery of the siege to a direct, unsparing indictment and a kind of moral accounting. This isn't just vague condemnation, it's a specific catalog of the sins that triggered God's decisive action.
Right, the indictment is laid bare. Nineveh is a city of blood. It's full of lies and plunder. It's given over to sorcery and seduction. And this highlights the crucial point that God's judgment is never arbitrary. It's always an act of moral righteousness. Assyria's horrific acts were not just clever geopolitical maneuvering. They were sustained acts of violence, deceit, and moral outrage that God had observed, recorded, and tallied perfectly. Their power was built on a foundation of lies and blood.
And to underscore just how serious Nineveh's delusion of invincibility was, Nahum uses this massive historical comparison. He asks Nineveh a rhetorical question by pointing to the recent fall of Noamon, the great city of Thebes in Egypt.
Okay, we probably need to elaborate on Thebes for a moment, because for the audience in Nineveh, this comparison would have been terrifying. Thebes was, in many ways, the Egyptian equivalent of Nineveh, a massive, ancient, magnificent city, resplendent with temples and treasures. And strategically, it was incredibly secure. It's situated along the Great Nile River, protected by a network of alliances, including Ethiopia and Put. So when the Assyrians themselves sacked Thebes in 663 BC, it was seen as the conquest of the unconquerable.
So the rhetorical question becomes, if Thebes, with its walls, its river, its alliances, and its immense wealth, if that city could be utterly shattered, reduced to ruin, with its leaders deported and its population taken captive, why, Nineveh, do you imagine you're any different?
And that delivers such a sobering universal lesson for every generation and every empire that relies only on its material strength. Every empire that lives by the sword and trusts in its own power will eventually run out of scabbards to hide that sword in. They can't protect themselves from the vengeance their own cruelty has summoned. Their foundation of power is ultimately just sand.
And here we come back to that great paradox, the thing that makes the judgment comfortable for Judah. All this terrible, decisive judgment against the enemy is profoundly good news for God's covenant people. The oracle that torches Nineveh's misplaced confidence is the very same word that rekindles Judah's long-dormant hope.
The promise, repeated throughout this short book, it becomes Judah's lifeline. The Lord is a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knows those who seek shelter in him. But we need to make sure the balance is right here. We know Judah wasn't innocent. Other prophets, like Jeremiah, were very clear that Judah was facing God's discipline. So how does Nahum distinguish between the discipline God administered to Judah and the destruction he brought on Nineveh?
That's a vital theological distinction. The prophets are clear. God's dealings with his covenant people, even when they're painful and severe, are ultimately fatherly and restorative. The purpose of discipline is to bring about repentance and purification, to ensure the survival of the remnant. It's rooted in love and covenant faithfulness. However, the destruction that's meted out to Nineveh, the relentless, unrepentant enemy of God's redemptive purposes, that is final and absolute. The fall of Nineveh is a living, historical parable that affirms two things at once. God's justice against his enemies is certain, and his care for his own is immutable. The rod that corrects his children is not the hammer that crushes his foes.
That distinction provides a tremendous amount of comfort. It means that even when God uses a wicked nation like Assyria as a rod to discipline his people, he always maintains sovereignty over the rod itself. When the rod becomes too proud, he breaks it.
That leads us right into the deeper theological terrain in the source material, particularly how we read Nahum through what's called a dispensational framework. Now, for our listener who might not be steeped in systematic theology, when we talk about a dispensational reading, we're not talking about arbitrarily dividing history into little boxes. We're talking about recognizing successive administrations or stewardships where God governs human affairs according to his revealed purposes. And crucially, this framework always maintains the absolute unified character of God. He's always merciful, but he administers his plan differently through different ages.
Okay, that's a helpful clarification.
Yeah.
I think the great utility of this view is that it forces us to see Nahum's event, the fall of Nineveh, not as some one-off anecdote, but as a repeatable, established pattern that God employs throughout history.
Exactly. First and foremost, Nahum vindicates God's righteousness in the grand theater of history. The great aching question that godly people ask in every single age is, can the wicked prosper indefinitely without consequence? Can the powerful commit atrocities and never have to answer for them? Nahum provides a thunderous, historical no.
So we see the pattern clearly here.
Yeah.
Assyria was allowed to function as a temporary instrument of discipline against God's people. They were God's razor, to use Isaiah's language. But the moment that instrument exalted itself, multiplied its violence, and began to boast as if it were the ultimate sovereign, God acted decisively to break it. It just confirms that eternal truth. Divine patience is always measured against the need for divine severity when impenitence becomes institutionalized.
And this pattern doesn't stop in 612 BC. The source material really highlights that this historical event, the swift fall of a proud, violent Gentile power, foreshadows the ultimate consummation of history.
Okay, help us connect the dots there. How does the destruction of this one city, Nineveh, foreshadow the end times? Why does this historical moment matter for the King of Kings?
Because it provides the rhythm of God's dealing with the nations that transcends all human administrations. Nahum shows us that when the final Gentile power structure, the last great empire that exalts itself against God, arises, the same immutable character of God will respond. The Lord will bring that power low with the appearing of Christ. Nahum establishes the pattern. Divine patience for a season, followed by divine severity upon impenitence, and always concluding with divine preservation for the remnant who trust him. Nineveh's collapse is like a down payment toward the much larger settlement still to come in redemptive history. It guarantees the end of all oppressive, proud world systems.
And this also clarifies the way Nahum holds mercy and judgment together. They're not two opposing forces, but
Yeah.
what did you say? Twin expressions of God's holy character. We started this dive by contrasting Jonah and Nahum. Jonah proved that mercy can be extended even to Nineveh. Nahum provides the severe counterpoint. That same extraordinary mercy, when you knowingly presume upon it and ultimately abandon it for a return to violence, becomes a definitive summons to judgment.
Grace and justice are inextricably linked. They're never on opposite sides of the ledger. And this powerful theological balance, it protects the reader in every age from two pervasive spiritual pitfalls.
Okay, the first pitfall I imagine is despair. It guards us against the cynicism that justice will never ever come for the powerful and the wicked who seem so untouchable. When we look at global headlines and see evil flourishing, it's so easy to slip into that kind of despair.
Precisely. Nahum insists that God keeps perfect books. The other pitfall is presumption. The naive or even arrogant idea that judgment will never arrive for those who persist in sin because, God is too loving.
Hmm.
Nahum assures us that in God, both are absolutely true. He is profoundly slow to anger, but he will by no means clear the guilty. He is not just a referee, he is the ultimate active judge.
I appreciate that emphasis on balancing the ledger. The immediate comfort for Judah was, of course, relief from Assyria's terror. But the long-term, ultimate comfort pointed far beyond the current geopolitics, didn't it?
Absolutely. The book significantly strengthens Israel's ultimate hope within God's overall covenant program. It looks past the collapse of one empire to the ultimate promised future when Israel's harrowing under all Gentile domination finally gives way to restoration under the Messiah's glorious permanent rule. Nahum is just rehearsing the rhythm we need to remember. Topple proud thrones, preserve his people, advance the covenant promises. God's plan is not derailed by world events. He governs them toward a specific, glorious end.
And we can see this larger scope, this guarantee of universal sovereignty, in Nahum's use of creation imagery. This is more than just dramatic language, isn't it?
Oh, much more. Nahum uses language that sounds apocalyptic, even cosmic. He describes the seas drying up at God's rebuke, the mountains quaking and melting like wax, the earth itself heaving under the weight of his presence. This isn't just regional poetry about an earthquake in Mesopotamia. It hints at a much wider theological horizon. It foreshadows the day when divine intervention is not just a local skirmish against Nineveh, but a comprehensive global overhaul of the established world order.
The takeaway from that creation imagery is profound. The God who spoke through Nahum is the same God who spoke the world into existence, and he can unmake or remake it at will. The same divine power that shook Nineveh and brought down its mighty walls is the power that shakes heaven and earth. It confirms that the Lord who leveled a single, proud human empire will one day level the entire world's proud system and definitively install his anointed king to reign.
The collapse of Nineveh in this grand prophetic view becomes an unshakable guarantee. If he did that for a single nation in 612 BC, just imagine what he will do when the final ultimate rebellion of humanity peaks. He will not fail to establish his kingdom. We've established the historical foundation and the robust theological framework. So now let's bring this ancient prophecy forward into our lives today. Because the source material makes a key observation. Nahum is not a manual for political strategy or for calculating geopolitical timetables. It is, above all, a summons to theological sanity.
And what does that mean practically for someone listening today? If we aren't supposed to be calculating the timing of world events, what is the most practical step for us?
The most practical thing Judah could do then, and the most practical thing we can do now, is to take refuge in the Lord. I mean, we live in seasons where evil seems utterly entrenched. We watch institutions fail. We see the boastful mock the very idea that God even exists, let alone that he sees or will act decisively. Nahum's answer to this pervasive cynicism or panic is always a return to the unchanging refuge of God's character.
I often find that when Christians feel overwhelmed by world events, they feel forced into one of two unhelpful reactions. Either cynicism, which leads to spiritual apathy, or this kind of frantic, often misplaced political action that elevates temporal solutions above the eternal king. How does Nahum guide us past those two errors?
Nahum provides the spiritual gravity. When we are deeply and pastorally convinced that God truly governs history, that he is not surprised or worried by the headlines, it allows us to live cleanly and faithfully in what feels like unclean and chaotic times. We can consciously refuse the shortcuts of anger and bitterness, which so often lead to sin and ineffective activism.
Yeah.
And we can refuse the seductions of despair, which cripple our ability to act rightly and faithfully in our own spheres of influence. Theological sanity lets us breathe deeply and act responsibly.
So this shelter he talks about, it's not about spiritual escapism. It's about spiritual empowerment to live in present obedience.
Absolutely. That confidence in God's governance is what gives us the courage to pursue righteousness in our homes, our churches, our communities, even when it feels like our efforts are totally insignificant. The confidence is that faithfulness is never wasted, even if it isn't immediately or obviously rewarded in this life. We don't need instant gratification. We have the promise of final justice.
That really changes the nature of comfort. The comfort Nahum offers isn't the comfort of ease. He doesn't promise an end to troubles or persecution. But it is the bracing comfort of alignment with a king who we know definitively will have the final authoritative word on history. We can be quiet in our souls even when the world is screaming.
But the book of Nahum also provides a bracing warning that we have to translate into our own context. It speaks to anyone tempted to presume upon divine patience. We saw Nineveh's tragic trajectory. They once tasted genuine mercy under Jonah's ministry. But a later generation, a century removed from that spiritual awakening, they just shrugged at that extraordinary act of grace. They willfully returned to their ingrained patterns of violence, idolatry, and conquest.
That is profoundly sobering. A deep memory of a past revival or a past conversion or a historical season of grace within a family or a nation. It's not a permanent hedge against future judgment. It just reinforces that every single generation, and indeed every individual within that generation, must respond afresh to the God who speaks. We can't rely on our parents' faith or our nation's spiritual heritage.
And when we translate that warning into the context of the church age, the era we live in now, our fresh response centers entirely on the person and work of Christ. The cross stands as the definitive, ultimate display of God's character, embodying the very paradox that Nahum introduces.
Okay, help us elaborate on that connection. How is the cross the ultimate expression of Nahum's twin themes of justice and mercy?
Well, the cross is the one place where absolute justice and overflowing mercy meet without any contradiction. Justice is fully displayed because the penalty for sin, that requirement that God will by no means clear the guilty, was fully paid definitively in the death of Christ. Yet at the very same moment, overwhelming mercy is displayed because a way has been made for any person, regardless of their past, to be reconciled to God. The same God who shattered Nineveh's imperial ambition laid the crushing burden of our iniquity upon his Son.
So this means those who flee to Christ find that secure refuge that Nahum promised, a stronghold that no army, no political regime, and no global power structure can ever breach. It's eternal.
However, the corollary is also true for those who consciously spurn him and reject the refuge offered at the cross. Those who return to their old ways, presuming upon God's patience, they discover the sober truth that judgment is not a mere theological metaphor. It remains a terrifying reality held in reserve for all impenitents.
Finally, we have to acknowledge that Nahum dignifies that profound spiritual ache for justice that every believer feels when looking at the systemic evil in the world. It's not wrong or unspiritual to long for God to step in and set things right. The essay affirms that this longing for a righteous, balanced world is actually an expression of deep faith in a just God.
Nahum trains this longing. We must desire that justice God's way, with the understanding that he is the judge and in God's time. We can't take justice into our own hands or insist on immediate resolution. We're reminded that the Lord keeps both perfect books and perfect time. His slowness is not neglect, it's measured grace leading up to an unshakable verdict. So we've completed our deep dive into the book of Nahum, a prophecy that truly balances thunder and shelter. It thunders relentlessly against Nineveh, a city that foolishly traded borrowed repentance for renewed violence, believing divine patience would last forever. But in the very same scroll, it shelters a fearful, anxious people, assuring them that the God who rules the storm and determines the fate of nations is their unfailing refuge, even when the ground seems to shake underneath them.
As a historical oracle, Nahum explains exactly why Nineveh fell. As a theological witness, it declares exactly how God always acts. And as a prophetic signpost, it points consistently beyond the temporary reign of any single Gentile power to the ultimate day when the kingdoms of this world will finally, irrevocably, become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. That original word of Nahum still stands, because the God who spoke through him still reigns.
And so we return to that beautiful, grounding passage that summarizes the heart of the entire book. It's found in Nahum chapter 1, verse 7. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him.
That is the core encouragement we can take away. This promise means that when the day of trouble comes for the proud, for the great empires of this age, no amount of power or wealth will shelter them from divine justice. But when the day of trouble comes for the faithful, for you, the people who have fled to Christ and taken refuge in his character, the Lord himself, the great sovereign of history, will shelter you with his very presence.
May you know the goodness of the Lord as your unfailing refuge today and in all your days.